Good evening and welcome. This is Munich Dialogues on Democracy. I'm Bartley Grosser-Richter, and together with our partners at the Yale Club of Germany and Munich's Amerikahaus, I'd like to thank you for joining us. These past few months have reinforced how fragile democracy can be and how important it is to engage wherever you can to stand up for it. So thank you all for taking the time to join us tonight. We're meeting virtually due to pandemic restrictions, and there are some in our virtual audience tonight to whom I would like to offer a special welcome. Greetings to the board members of Munich's Amerikahaus, and thank you for coming. And as many of you know, our guest tonight is a Harvard man through and through, where he is currently a senior fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. So we at the Yale Club are pleased to have the local Harvard Club participating in tonight's event. We save our rivalry for football games and extend a warm welcome to our Munich Harvard Club friends. Our guest tonight, Robert B. Zoellick, is one of America's most senior public officials. Welcome to Munich, if only virtually. Early in his career, under the Reagan administration, he served in various positions at the Department of the Treasury, including counselor to then Secretary James Baker. During the George H.W. Bush administration, he served as Undersecretary of State and Bush's personal representative to the G7 economic summits in 91-92. Many in our audience here in Germany will recognize him for his pivotal role in the negotiation around German reunification, where he led the US delegation, and for which he received Germany's highest federal decoration, the Knight Commander's Cross, in 1992. Under George W. Bush, he served as a foreign policy advisor, as well as US trade representative, where, amongst other things, he completed negotiations to bring China and Taiwan into the World Trade Organization, and he developed a strategy to launch new global trade negotiations at the WTO meeting in Doha, Qatar. Then in 2005, President Bush made him Deputy Secretary of State. He was the major architect of the Bush administration's policies regarding China, but equally important at the time was his work on the Darfur peace process. Then from 2007 to 2012, he was president of the World Bank. And in 2012, he advised the Mitt Romney presidential campaign. This is not the complete list of his impressive positions. His expertise spans 6 US presidencies during the Cold War, in its closing chapter, and in the first decades of the 21st century. With such a distinguished career, we had to ask what the etiquette was about titles, which one supersedes the others. And his answer was that I am to address him as Bob, which I find a very kind gesture. He's just written a book that has been touted, and I can wholeheartedly second, quote, a sweeping work of history and an insightful guide to US diplomacy, past and present. It's called America and the World, A History of US Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. In chapters that go from Benjamin Franklin, Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, through the 19th century into Teddy Roosevelt, Henry Kissinger, James Baker with George H.W. Bush, he tells the vibrant story of American diplomacy. New is his successful effort to internationalize the context of the US stories. In so doing, he identifies 5 traditions that have emerged from America's encounters with the world. And I look forward to hearing more about that tonight. Now, it gives me special pleasure to welcome our moderator, Claire Berlinski. Hi, Claire. Claire is a journalist and an author. She has a degree in modern history and a doctorate in international relations from Oxford University. She has written books about Margaret Thatcher, as well as how what happens in Europe affects the United States. She's lived in and reported from Southeast Asia and Turkey, and is now based in Paris and the editor of the Cosmopolitan Globalist. Before we start, one last thing, as always, you can ask questions either via the YouTube chat or email to event@amerikahaus.de. That's the German spelling event@amerikahaus.de. Our fantastic partners over there will be monitoring the questions for us, and we'll try to get to as many as possible in the 1 hour that we have. So with no further ado, welcome Bob, welcome Claire, and Claire, over to you in Paris to take it away. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Bartley, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to Amerikahaus for inviting me. Ambassador, I've been reading your book with such curiosity and pleasure over the past week. I'm going to show it to the audience again. It's really worth it. Is that a thumbs up from you? It's really something that tells me a lot of things I never knew. I'm going to let you tell the audience about that, though. Let me just read a little bit from chapter 18. My stories suggest that a different approach to American diplomacy may be more useful, and I'll let you tell the audience what isn't useful. The concepts from international relations and doctrines help frame debates, but they don't offer policymakers guidance about what to do. Ambassador, what's this book about? And why did you think it needed to be written?
Well, thank you, Claire, and thanks to Bartley and Wolfgang and Dominic and Joanna. First, I have to notice that since this was a combined Yale, Munich, and Bavaria event, I did try to dress appropriately with Blau and Weiß here. So a few words on what the book is about. As both you and Bartley mentioned, my focus is on stories of how leading Americans sought to address the foreign policy problems of their era over 200 years, from Ben Franklin to George H.W. Bush in 1989-92. So I focus particularly on people and particular episodes. And in doing so, as you mentioned, Claire, I wanted to focus on the practical problem solving side of diplomacy. I also add my assessments based on experience and insights on the conduct of diplomacy. But along the way, I wanted to try to draw out some of the ideas that have contributed to the pluralism of American diplomacy over some 200 years and identify the 5 traditions. I do close with an afterword that briefly examines the Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, and a bit of the Trump lens through the eye of the 5 traditions. I had a seminar of faculty and graduate students at Harvard, and they said, oh, you can't quite end in 1992. So I added this afterword. But in a way, the book is a multiple biography. And I wanted to try to bring the tales to life for another generation. And in particular for this audience, what's striking, and Bartley alluded to this, I tried to do this in a way that also gave some broader international context of what was going on. And I made a few notes in preparation for this, just observing that a number of chapters involve US-German relations. So first, there's the period where the United States and Imperial Germany are sort of rising powers. We often don't reflect on the fact that the wars of German unification were about the same time as the US Civil War. And after both of those, they're the 2 rising powers in the system, and how they run into each other, whether it's in China or the Russo-Japanese War or the Caribbean or the first Moroccan crisis that Teddy Roosevelt mediated. And then I have a chapter on Woodrow Wilson that focuses on the decision from 1914 to 17 for the United States to enter the war. But I also identify an intriguing little aspect about the possible missed opportunity by Woodrow Wilson to mediate a peace in late 1916, early 1917, that the record now shows that Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg was quite committed to. And then, of course, there's a chapter on the 1947-49 diplomacy, the US strategy after World War II, involving the Marshall Plan, which wouldn't have worked without the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany, the Berlin airlift, and NATO. And then I also talk about the crises in Berlin that historians now believe are pretty connected to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961-62. So whether it's the creation of the wall, the showdown at Checkpoint Charlie, John F. Kennedy's Berlin speech, and how John F. Kennedy learned through those crises, quite importantly, for his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then finally, I have a chapter on President Bush and Secretary of State Baker, for whom I work, but not on the unification issue, but on the early 1989 issue, where they build a special partnership with the Federal Republic of Germany, even before unification, to try to cooperate in ending the Cold War. You also asked, Claire, briefly, sort of why did I write it? And this may be of interest to people in general public or public servants. When I was in government, I often used history as I thought about problems. And I wanted to encourage others to look through this lens. as you know, with a doctorate in the field, many courses on foreign policy focus today on international relations theories. And they're interesting, they're challenging intellectually. I didn't find them too useful when I was dealing with questions like German unification or trade strategy or China policy or Darfur. And so I wanted to focus on the experience of practical problem solving. Now, some people may recall that Henry Kissinger wrote a book titled Diplomacy in the 90s, where he talked about history and foreign policy. But given Dr. Kissinger's predilections, it tends to focus more on the European realpolitik tradition. And I wanted to use this book to talk about some of the American experience and ideas. And I suppose one last idea was that in those various government posts, I often used to have younger colleagues, and given my interest in history, I would often ask them about what history they knew, because I honestly didn't know what they learned. And I discovered that insofar as they learned history, it tended to be from World War II on. And at least in the case of the United States, the first 150 years were full of interesting people that I wanted to recall from the span of time. And as I've spoken to some universities, I've been encouraged because I didn't design it this way, but it turns out that after years of critical studies, thinking in foreign policy and other fields, some of the students find this to be a little bit optimistic because they recognize that history can offer insights on how to do better, not just timeless obstacles. I think you're on mute, Claire. I think you're muted, Claire.
Okay, how's that?
That's great.
Okay, I wasn't muted. That was someone else's fault. I want that to be very clear. All right, let's go to 1989. I think that's really the most interesting thing we could have you talk about tonight, although Bartley and I have at least 1 million, we counted, questions for you. I'm just going to, again, read from your book. As the new Bush administration surveyed the panorama of transformation, perhaps even revolution, one place on the map drew the most attention: West Germany. Remember, we're talking about 1989. There might be young people in the audience who don't realize what a pivotal, transformational year that was. It was one of the most significant of the century, and that was hardly a century lacking in transformational years. Since the time of the Marshall Plan, America's strategy for the revival and integration of Western Europe depended on cooperation with the Federal Republic of Germany. The repeated crises in Berlin had symbolized in stark human terms the American commitment to German freedom. NATO's mission depended on both the defense of the FRG and the troops of the Bundeswehr, the German military that served as part of the Allied integrated command. West Germany would be the political Schwerpunkt, to use Karl von Clausewitz's strategic term, for ending the Cold War. You were present at the creation. You were there. You lived through that year. And what's more, you didn't have the benefit of hindsight. You didn't know this was going to work out okay. And there was plenty of reason to think it wasn't going to work out okay. Can you walk us through that year from your point of view?
Well, let's break it into two parts because they're both interesting. And the first part, which is the one I discussed in the book, is not generally recognized. As you mentioned, Claire, and as a German audience will be well aware, at least if they lived during this period, that in 1989, the phenomenon of Gorbachev was magnetic because it offered hopes of a transformation at the end of the Cold War. And so many of the histories focus, understandably, on policies towards the Soviet Union and then later Russia. But our principal aim was actually focused first on Germany. And it was really an alliance first strategy. And the reason why was that people will recall in early 1989, there had just been the INF treaties, which eliminated all intermediate range nuclear missiles. But this left the short range missiles. And as one German political leader at the time said, the shorter the missiles, the deader the Germans. So the idea that NATO had of modernizing those short range missiles was not so popular in Germany. And in fact, Germany wanted to be part of a negotiation of those missiles. And that was a sharp division with Margaret Thatcher, for example, who you've written about. So our first challenge was, how do we have to unite the alliance? And Bush came up with a proposal that was hugely significant. Very little recalled now, but it was a conventional forces negotiation proposal. And the idea was, if we could drastically reduce the conventional forces, so these are the armies, the tanks, the armored personnel carriers, the planes, the helicopters, the troops, and in fact, move them to equal levels, there would be less need for the nuclear deterrence, because traditionally the Soviet forces had a 3-to-1 advantage. So he came up with this rather bold conventional forces proposal, but it had ancillary benefits, which is, we thought, if we could get Soviet forces to start to leave Eastern Europe, that would also support the movements for reform. If there were a reversal in the Soviet Union, well, it would be harder to bring the troops back. And it should also help Gorbachev by reducing a lot of the costs. So Bush came up with this proposal in May, right before a NATO summit. And to share with you a small anecdote about this, I was the lead official at the table before the ministers, to try to negotiate the communique. So my counterpart across the table was Horst Telchik, the assistant for the chancellor. To my right was a British NATO ambassador, Sir Michael Alexander, who worked for Thatcher. And during the course of the afternoon, we put together a communique that met pretty much all our needs, except on the short-range nuclear missile issue. But we had language that, frankly, 3 different brackets, any one of which would have suited the United States. So as we go into the evening session, I move to the back chair for Secretary Baker. Hans-Dietrich Genscher moves in for Germany. We've got Geoffrey Howe for Britain. And as the night goes on, Sir Michael Alexander keeps jumping up and speaking into Geoffrey Howe's ear. And we all knew that Howe was not on the best of terms with Thatcher. And it was quite clear that Alexander was instructing Howe on his position. And Howe would raise his hand and make a point that looked a little peripheral, but then Baker kept coming right back and saying, I agree with Geoffrey, I agree with Geoffrey. And so at some point around 11 or 12 at night, I say to Baker, I said, Mr. Secretary, why are you doing this? I said, you're dissipating a lot of the goodwill, and we don't have to stand up for a lot of these points. They're trivial. And Baker said to me, he said, look, he said, sometime late tonight, early tomorrow morning, my friend, and here he's talking about President Bush, is going to have to decide who's running the alliance, him or her. And he was meaning Margaret Thatcher. And he said, I watched Margaret Thatcher wrap Ronald Reagan around her little finger time and again. He said, and when that moment comes, I want to make it as easy as possible for my friend to say, Margaret, Jim stood with Geoffrey every step of the way. You couldn't ask for anything more. We now have to decide, and I decide this. And I thought, wow, I'm negotiating at the table. Baker's about 2 or 3 steps ahead. And then, of course, as a good minister, I later learned this, he called by phone to Bush a couple times during the night just to check in, make sure that he understood what we're doing. But then there's a German sequel to the story. So remember, we were just starting to get to know Genscher. Baker had known Kohl because he had been a Secretary of the Treasury. We were starting to get to know Genscher. And so at one point, Baker gets up, the table stops the discussion. He starts to walk towards Genscher. Genscher gets up. And Genscher, the shrewd, smart, experienced hand, sort of is scowling a little bit. And Baker says to him, Hans Dietrich, he said, I think we have to help Geoffrey. I think he's in a tight spot. And all of a sudden, Genscher breaks out in a smile and he says, yeah, that terrible woman, referring to Thatcher. And all of a sudden he understands he's not really negotiating with Baker. Baker's trying to navigate this to sort of bring everybody on board. And the point about that story was a lot of the histories have kind of ignored the fact that in the first months, the Bush administration had to secure the support of our allies. And this focus that you mentioned on Germany was critically important because we anticipated the ice of the Cold War was breaking. And that obviously led us to be in a much better position when it came time for unification. I think there must be in the system clear and locked you out. So
how about that?
That's good.
Okay. You anticipated the ice of the Cold War would be breaking, and you're someone who's read a great deal of history, so you must have known this is unbelievably dangerous. Empires don't tend to fold peacefully. And when we look at it in retrospect, it all seems to have worked out just fine. I'll just read from your book again. Students of Russia ponder the Russian question. Bush was alert to addressing the German question first. The future of a unified democratic Germany was fundamental to Western, Central, and Eastern Europe, as well as to transatlantic ties. An effective policy toward Russia required US-European alignment. Bush had inherited and personally embodied the strategic logic of the American founders of the alliance system of 1947 to 49. Why did it work out okay?
Well, to start with, you're drawing out a very important point that I think is even relevant to diplomacy today. What the chapters in my book show is that at various points in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, there's always a tendency to focus on the principal adversary. And so the question is, do you focus most on the Soviet Union or do you focus first on your allies? And so the whole story of 1947-49 was a decision by Marshall and Atchison that first you had to secure the alliance. The people may not be aware, the whole story, the Marshall Plan was designed to avoid a security commitment. It was to try to recreate the economy of Western Europe. And that's what led people to create the Federal Republic of Germany, because they realized it wouldn't work without the Federal Republic of Germany. And then once you create the Federal Republic of Germany, you've got a Soviet reaction, the Berlin airlift, you've got the French concern, and that leads to NATO. So these steps were not sitting down and planned by somebody in some room away from the sort of the action. And then you have the same issue actually in the Berlin Wall issues in 1961-62. It's one of the issues that is so poignant about JFK's Berlin speech, where he's finally realizing that Berlin isn't so much a risk and a problem, this city that's isolated behind the East German and Soviet lines, but it's an asset in the Cold War. And the people of Berlin personally convey this. And there's a wonderful Berlin, sorry, this is for Munich here, but there's a wonderful Berliner aspect of this, which is that, here's this capital of the Third Reich that by 1949, and certainly in 1961, and again in 1989, becomes a symbol of liberty and freedom and moving the process. So for us in 1989, from the unification point of view, our diplomacy operated at two different levels. One was a sense of history and strategy, but the other was a fingertip feel, Fingerspitzengefühl would be the German word for the situation on the ground. So on the history, as we both said, many people focused on the Russia question. Our first priority was the German question. And what we meant by that was that after 1871 and the unification of Germany, you had this challenge. You had this big power in the heart of Europe, Mitteleuropa, if you want, without sort of natural borders. And how do you deal with that? Well, after 1945, the solution was to have two German states, and the West German state was embedded within the European structures, the EC, later the European Union, and used also from NATO. So while we wanted to support a united democratic Germany, and Bush talks about this as early as May of '89 in a public interview, we wanted to do so in a way that would also be constructive for Europe and transatlantic relations. And that was our focus on having a unified democratic Germany within NATO and a further integrated European Union. We thought that would be positive for Europe. We thought it would reassure neighbors to the East and West. And also was a key part of Germany's own sort of identity. There was another historical aspect that people haven't noted. We wanted to avoid what we called a Versailles victory. And what I mean by that is a settlement that plants the seeds of its own destruction. And this had a German aspect in particular. If you go back and you look closely at the negotiations and statements of that period, we were focused on not singularizing Germany was our term. We didn't want to discriminate against Germany. And our thought was, even though Germans would be delighted at unification in 1990, we didn't want some future generation of Germans to say, why are we being discriminated against? Why are we being treated as second-class citizens? Now, in 1990, that might have seemed a far-off idea, but if you consider some of the political movements in Central and Eastern Europe today, maybe it's not quite so distant, so it's a good step. And of course, for the Soviet Union, we wanted to do the best we could in offering reassurances on security, economic benefits, borders, and political standing. So that was the history and strategy. But there's another critical point about the facts on the ground. And this is where the German people come to the fore, because they are the forces that really create the momentum for German unification. It's a continuation of the story that I mentioned of 48, 49, or 1953 in Berlin, or 61, or 89. And this is the interesting dynamic. If the diplomacy had stalled, we could have created a crisis on the ground. Who knows what would have broken out with either Stasi or with Soviet soldiers. And so the United States figured out we could use this momentum. We both had to respond to this, but we could also use this momentum to prod countries that were reluctant to move on unification. And at the start, that included almost everybody: Britain, France, obviously the Soviet Union. So then the challenge is, how do you coordinate your history and strategy with events on the ground? And that's what led us to create the so-called 2+4 process, the two Germanys, the four powers coming out of World War II, to sort of channel and coordinate. And not that the 2+4 was to deal with everything itself, because we had to deal with these CFE negotiations, we had changes in NATO, we had CSCE arrangements, there were economic aspects. And the amazing thing about this is that, you know, it all occurs within 10 to 11 months. So that's less time than we've had the pandemic. And
excuse me.
I was just going to say, so, you know, people, it's just useful to recall that by August of 90, you know, the wall comes down in November of 89, August of 90, you've got the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and my bosses are focused on that. By December, Shevardnadze resigns. By the next August, you had a coup in the Soviet Union. So all this was in the background, going to your point, Claire, that you never knew when the door would close.
I wonder how much preparation you did for, or in fact, I'm going to ask very specifically. We all know it could have gone otherwise. It did go otherwise at Tiananmen Square. And we know that Honecker was was filling Leipzig with body bags in the expectation that it was about to go otherwise. What would you have done had it gone otherwise?
Well, what I focus on is, I think it's very hard for policymakers to predict certain events, but you can anticipate. And I won't go on at length, but I could share some stories with you from early '89 where you could anticipate that there was the possibility of German unification early on. We were thinking about it. And then going to your point, all you can do is sort of increase your probabilities of managing it. So one key point was that, you know, recall at the time, President Bush was criticized for, quote, not dancing on the Berlin Wall, by sort of not pounding his chest. Well, this was all quite calculated because we had a lot of work to do with the Soviets. Yeah. There were some very sensitive issues, people may recall, in this time period where Lithuania sort of wanted to break out of the Soviet Union, and kind of how you sort of manage those questions. So you bring the Tiananmen Square, and that's a good example, because what people often forget is that that was happening at the same time. That happened the weekend after this NATO meeting that I talked about. And Gorbachev, by the way, never denounced that. So you always were worried that was in the back of your mind. Now, all you can try to do in those situations is to make clear to the Soviets that if they took those actions, that it would be the end of their outreach to the West, and that others would have to respond. And Gorbachev, by this point, had invested so much in glasnost as part of his perestroika and his new thinking that it would have been extremely costly for him. And so then you use the momentum of events while trying to create an explanation for the other side. And this is a key part of the diplomacy. There's a point in the negotiations where the Soviets are being reluctant. And I remember saying to a couple of my colleagues, look, I actually sort of identified 9 different items that we tried to meet their interest. And I said, I wonder if those have registered. And frankly, I don't think they had. So I drafted them as 9 points that Baker made and I made. And the Soviets later recognized how these became sort of important items to show that the United States and the West was also trying to recognize their interest. When you have particularly fast-moving events, you have to be aware that the other party may not necessarily have it all figured out, just like you don't have it all figured out. But if you can try to stay ahead and you can try to shape diplomacy and also meet some of the other party's needs, you have a far better chance of reaching some mutual accord, while, of course, using the leverage for your side. So at times people would say, you know, was this being pushed on the Soviets? Yes, it was being pushed on the Soviets. And that goes back to the point about our commitment to a democratic Germany for 40 years. You're muted again.
I swear I'm not doing this.
No, it's obviously automatically.
Do you think that Germany has lost its centrality and importance in global politics?
And in fact, I mean, that's kind of the codicil to this story. While we were trying to sort of deal with the last chapters of history of World War II in 1989-90, or the Cold War, we were keenly aware that we were setting up the future. And our view was that the United Germany, by dint of its size, its economic weight, its place in Europe, would become the most important country in Europe. So at the same time, we tried to develop our relationships with the European Commission, the changing European Union, but we wanted to have a good partnership with Germany. And so obviously, I find it sad and unfortunate over past years where people have underappreciated the importance of that relationship. One reason I started out historically was it didn't just start with World War II. It's probably started with the mid-19th century or even earlier with immigrants. And so while the two countries are going to have differences, they certainly should have a lot more in common that works out together. Now, from a German perspective, you know, Germans had to deal with unification. Then they had to deal with the European Union. There are some political, cultural attitudes towards economic policy that were deeply embedded in terms of German economic policy that were related to ECB and dealing with the Euro crisis. There were some nerve-wracking moments at that along the way. There's obviously questions about sort of use of military and defense power. But part of diplomacy is sort of understanding how your counterparts look at things, and you can try to prod and push, but I don't think there's any question about the critical role of a European Germany in the future of both Europe and Germany.
I agree with you for what it's worth. I wonder, though, why have Americans forgotten this? Why have they been so willing to believe that it would be useful to the United States to abuse a democratic and united Germany that America helped bring into the world? What's going on with the American people that they think this is okay to declare German cars a security threat?
Well, I think, you know, America is a big country. You have to differentiate among different attitudes. If you look at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs polling data, the attitudes of the average American towards Germany is warmer than the average German toward the United States these days. And that also what I think needs to understand is that, you know, frankly, given the US role in post-World War II Germany and German democracy, there's a special affinity in Germany towards the United States. And if you want your uncle acts like he's crazy, you probably sort of lose a sense of confidence in it. Now, Trump had no sense of history. He looked at everything transactionally. He looked at it, he didn't have a sense of systems, whether it be economic or alliance. And so he would look at the fact that, you know, the US tariff for autos is 2.5% and Europe's is 10% and say, that's not fair. Well, a lot of Americans might agree with that, but you have to understand kind of how the trading system is set up. A lot of Americans believe that Germany, which is committed to trying to reach the 2% GDP limit for NATO, has fallen short and it's not carrying its weight. I think there's truth to that. At the same time, you don't want to put the whole relationship on that item alone. And there's other things that Germany has done that important, Central and Eastern Europe and with Ukraine and others. So in a way, going back to your point about Bush and Baker, I titled that chapter Alliance Leader. And there's a special role in being an alliance leader, which is that you're not going to be able to direct everybody just to do things. You have to create a structure where other countries also see it as being able to pursue their interests. And that means you have to focus on your top priorities and have some room in some of the others sort of on the margin. And then there's legitimate debate. So going back to our story here, the United States was very much focused on trying to have a Europe whole and free. trying to end the Cold War peacefully, unify a democratic Germany. Now and then that got us into conflicts with other allies. But it also allowed us, for example, on the question of the German-Polish border, to help create reassurance to the Poles at a time where there was some, at least apparent question mark from the way that Kohl had stated his policy on these things. So that's the nature of alliance leadership. And that's quite relevant to today if you look at how Biden is trying to reposition things.
Yes, I think I hear what you're saying. Look at the whole record. Come on. It's just one president. But 75 million Americans didn't just vote for him once. They did it twice. What does that say to the world?
Well, I think that says something about the mood in the United States. It doesn't have something to do about the US and German relationship. I don't think they voted for Trump because of his German policy.
Well, they certainly voted for someone whom they knew treated our allies with contempt.
Well, look, I've served in Republican administrations, but early on, I thought that, I took a stand against Trump because of, I disagreed with his policies, but also his character and I think how he would conduct himself. But if I try to be fairly analyzing it, there's a debate about how much of Trump came in as a disruptor, and he's somebody that wanted to challenge the system. There's a debate that still goes on today. How much is this based on the economics after the global financial crisis? How much of it is based on identity? I tend to believe, and frankly, most of the political experts of this kind of look at the question of identity more than economics. And on the economic side, you'll notice that the number of the sort of white voters to Trump were not people that were at the bottom of the situation. They're people that were felt displaced. Some of this was anti-immigration. And we've seen in Germany or Sweden or others how big influxes of immigration can get a destabilized people's sense of their community. And then some of it was sort of the larger politics of what people will want to may characterize as being sort of the political correctness, different groups being sort of treated as disrespectfully. That's part of democratic politics, and that will play out in the process. And Trump, in my view, unfortunately, seized on that. And if you look to connect the foreign policy story with the domestic story, if you look at his foreign policy, it really was a derivative of his approach to reaching out to this public and saying, I'm going to be different than the people in the past. His trade protectionism, his wall with Mexico, these were symbolic statements about immigration and trade, about that he was going to change from the past policies. And that's one reason where I think it's important for all countries to understand the connection between the political and the economic. If I go back to German policy today, there'll be aspects of German policy, whether on borders or security issues or cybersecurity, that reflect the German political culture. And for democracies, if you're going to be an effective diplomat, France has a certain history where you are. And I remember once having a discussion with a French official, a friend, about France and NATO. And at least at that point, France as often was sort of just being obstructionist. And as I was expressing my frustration, he said to me, Bob, you need to understand. He said, France is a defeated country, and it takes decades to overcome that. And, that's one of those things that in terms of their self-image that one has to appreciate if you're going to sort of work with a power.
Yes.
So but I'd come back to the point that if I look and we're going to see this now with China, because obviously, in my view, there's an overstatement in US politics about China, but there's a lot of things we don't like about China in terms of human rights and sort of other behavior and security threat. And the general view would be that, say, Germany is more interested in its commercial relationship with China. Right. And therefore, when the Chinese pressed late in the year for this investment agreement, that Germany was a major force behind it. But we'll see how that works, because my guess now it's going to struggle with the European Parliament because of some of Chinese actions. Yeah. So this is what I think is important in this larger story is how democracies have the commonality of interest, how they need to recognize differences. But remember, my whole book is about solving problems. So what I try to do in each chapter is get beyond the headlines of this theory or that theory or this balance or this realism or idealism or others, and say, what's the practical work that people have to do? And that's how I conducted my career, and that's what the stories are about.
I have so many more questions I would like to ask you, but we don't have that much time. And we've also got some very interesting questions from our listeners. So I'm going to ask some of those, but since I've got you now in a position where you really can't say no, may I ask you these questions via email later or on the phone? Because I really want the answers.
I'll try to be of help. It's a bit of a busy time, but I'll. And in fact, I've got the Office of the Transatlantic Coordinator in the German Foreign Ministry wants me to write a small piece I have to get done by April 6th on some of these points. So I'm afraid
the Cosmopolitan Globalist would love to have you write a piece on some of these points too.
Well,
would you consider writing for us?
Of course.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so question one, a very good question. What has the U.S. learned from the failure of its 1995 aid democratization and economic programs to assist Russia's development in the post-Soviet era? And I'm going to add a bit more to that. What have we all learned from that period about the possibility of exporting democracy?
Well, to relate this to my book, I have a chapter on a man named John Quincy Adams, and it's about the Monroe Doctrine. But what's important to understand about John Quincy Adams is that many American historians will refer to him as a realist. And what they mean by that is that he was focused on securing the continental US territory. And in particular, he did not want to be drawn into the democracy movement of the early 19th century, say, standing up for Greece and its efforts. And he has this famous quote about, "We not go abroad seeking monsters to destroy." And but at the same time, what I draw, and one of his biographers had drawn this out, if you read what John Quincy Adams says about republicanism, small r republicanism, he's as lyrical as Ronald Reagan or George Bush tried to be about sort of democracy. However, he was skeptical whether the ground would be sort of fertile for it in whether Latin America or the Europe of that age. And that's a useful caution. I mean, and what we've learned, of course, was he was too skeptical. We've seen how democracy is spread around the world. But as for the question about sort of the late 90s economic policy towards Russia, the lesson we learned is it's extremely hard to do. I mean, the Soviet Union and the breakup of the Russian economy was an extremely difficult venture in terms of how the command economy was sort of inefficient. When it broke up, it created opportunities for corruption, the critical role of law and governance issues, the need for macroeconomic stability. I mean, a German could look much closer to home because I dealt with all these issues with Poland in this exact period. And Poland had a greater history of markets. It had a greater sense of national unity, and it was a close run thing in Poland. And you're even seeing the aftershocks of it today in Polish politics. So in some ways, this also draws on my experience from the World Bank. You need to understand how the pieces relate, and it goes back to my point about probabilities. You can increase the potential for people to be successful. I think in more general terms, what people have learned in the field of economic development is the critical role of governance and state capacity, the transparency in the system, particularly if you try to do this in a democratic model. You have an alternative. The Chinese basically took a different development model under an authoritarian state, and it's proved very economically successful. But I think they're not finished with their transition yet either, and we'll see how that sort of works out.
Well, speaking of China, I don't think Americans realize that you're the most hated man in America, but you are the man.
Well, not quite sure I reached that level.
Well, you are the object of vituperation, precisely the person Trump is referring to when he says the dummy who negotiated these stupid trade deals and let China into the World Trade. I don't even think he knows what the World Trade Organization is, but this is on both the right and the left. There's now an emerging consensus that allowing China into the World Trade Organization was a mistake. And I wonder if you look back on that and think, I might have done things differently, or do you think it really was basically the right decision?
So yes, it was the right decision. I wrote an article in early 2020 for the National Interest called the China Challenge. Mm-hmm. And for those interested in it, I would commend it, because there are a number of pieces of it, but there's one key argument, which is, as you suggest, there's a new conventional wisdom in the United States that cooperation with China failed. And that's just historically false. If you look at, for example, cooperation on UN Security Council resolutions, and since we're talking about 89, 92, recall this was including sort of in the Gulf War and China abstaining so we could have a united UN Security Council, which, by the way, was critical for the Senate vote. Whether it's the Chinese economic response in the global financial crisis, which I must say was much stronger than Germany's, and moved from a 10% current account surplus to zero, quit manipulating exchange rates. For 15 years, it was the fastest location of growth for US exports. On issues like Iran and the sanctions and an environmental topic. So one can go on and on. Now, the point is not that all is swell with China. The point is, however, if you're going to deal with issues like pandemics and biological security or climate change or the world economy, how are you going to do so without China? And so the key point that you may be referring to is I gave a speech in 2005 often about China needing to become a responsible stakeholder. And if one of the things you encounter in life, but this is the way life works, is most of the people that cite the speech have never read it. And so they make the point that I said China was a responsible stakeholder. The real point was I said that by 2005, China was in the WTO, it was in the IMF, it was in the World Bank, it was UN Security Council permanent member, it was part of ozone treaties, on and on. The question was, it had benefited hugely from the system that the US had helped create over 50 years, and it needed to bear the responsibilities of that system. Now, frankly, again, coming back to practical diplomacy, I can never understand why people didn't like this idea, because it kept the US as the umpire. We'd decide whether China was being responsible. But the Chinese went along with it because it treated them respectfully and it acknowledged their role. And one has to sort of ask yourself those questions again, is that how are you going to deal with China, even if it's an authoritarian system? Now, there's no doubt that Xi Jinping in particular has moved to strengthen the Communist Party, and he's cracked down on different things. He's had the role of the state. Those are realities that you have to deal with, but we can't escape those fundamental questions about, how are you going to decide the areas where you deter China, work with China? And sometimes when people talk about cooperation with China, they sort of throw the human rights issues overboard. That's not my view. I believe we should stand for those topics, but I'll give you a practical example. So in Hong Kong, clearly they're absorbing Hong Kong into the traditional Chinese system, and in my view, they're violating the treaties. So we should treat Hong Kong like the rest of China. However, how much good does it do to sort of sanction Hong Kong's leaders? If you want to set a kind of show the difference between free and authoritarian societies, frankly, European Union and the US should do what Britain's done, which is offer to take the people from Hong Kong. Well, exactly. That's the best way to show the difference in the two societies. So what I'm trying to do with your question again, Claire, it's kind of the thesis of the book. You can talk about these at sort of very broad levels, or you can sort of dig into the practical questions about, how you're trying to work with the party, what are the common interests, where you draw the line. Obviously, I've been part of administrations that have fought wars. I'm not against the notion that when you need to sort of take the most drastic action. But I've also am somewhat careful and cautious about getting oneself into those situations, and I like to use power effectively.
Yeah. You're in something of a mental war throughout the book with Henry Kissinger, and you repeatedly, it's one of your 5 themes, insist that Americans are pragmatic. And I understand exactly what you mean. I know what you mean. You know what you mean. But what about Germans? Will they understand what we're talking about when we say we're a pragmatic people? How do you define it?
Maybe if they read the book. So first, what I was trying to draw attention to here, for those who've studied any philosophy, one knows that probably the principal American contribution to philosophy is Dewey and William James about pragmatism. And there's an overlap between the philosophical concept and the diplomatic concept. The overlap is, as opposed to having sort of concepts of theories or doctrines, you tend to focus on the practical, what works. How do you create results and accomplishments? Now, from a diplomatic point of view, just as I explained in the story about German unification, you have to try to understand what are the power sources on the ground: economic, military, political, votes. How do you try to maneuver those to be more effective in trying to accomplish your results? And again, with a sense of history, some notion that imperfect results in a far from perfect world can be an acceptable accomplishment. If we're going to try to achieve perpetual peace, that's a standard that none of us are going to achieve, I think, for a long period of time. So what I try to draw out in the book, and Baker is sort of an example of pragmatism, is try the idea of how you think about problem solving as opposed to just using intellectual paradigms. Now, you draw a contrast with Kissinger. I don't want to overdo it. I mean, Kissinger is quite shrewd, and he brought a notion. He has a wonderful sense of humor, as people know. He brought a notion. He said, America is the only country where being called a realist is an insult. What I look at the role that he and Nixon played with opening to China, and I have a lot of admiration for it. I think they underappreciated the economic dimensions of the United States, which I think was important in its revival. By the way, I think that's an important part of the story going forward as well, as many people in the German private sector will know. But on the other hand, I also think in a way, they undervalued some of the other ideas that have been part of the American diplomatic story, whether it's kind of the values, the economic commerce. And part of the reason I wrote the book was to say there's a greater pluralism that goes into American diplomacy, or that can go into diplomacy.
Yeah, the pluralism that goes into American diplomacy is something that's often underappreciated. People become, at least overseas, people become very fixated on the president, and they don't realize that that's not the only place they have to look to figure out where things are going. We have another question here, which is directly related. In your opinion, what should be the next steps the US and Germany or the EU should take in order to work on a more stable and friendlier transatlantic relationship?
So I'll start with the fact that just as in Germany, I mean, Germany is going to be going through a political season here now. I just saw the elections in Rheinland-Pfalz and Baden-Württemberg. Well, for the Biden administration, their number one priority is to deal with the pandemic and economic recovery. So my anecdote for this one was that when Baker was chief of staff for Reagan in 1981, he said, Mr. President, you have three priorities: economic recovery, and economic recovery. Well, Biden's number one priority is pandemic and economic recovery. At the same time, he has a very full agenda on issues, whether it be immigration, whether it be climate change, racial topics. What you can see is these so-called transnational issues have overlaps internationally. And that's a natural way to rebuild your partnerships, particularly with Europeans, on issues of climate and biological issues. So there's going to be trickier ones: information technology, cyber questions, and others. At the same time, I think it's important not to lose sight of some of the traditional security issues, such as the threat that Russia poses. This will be part of the European debate simply because of the Baltics, Poland, and others that are worried about sort of hybrid conflicts and others. I think one point that I am quite worried about that hasn't gotten much attention in the US or Germany is Britain's moving into a new stage here. And I'm a little worried that the EU policies are kind of trying to emphasize, well, we want to show that, Brexit wasn't such a good thing. And it kind of also falls back into the EU's rather legalistic order that sort of is the heart of the Brussels system.
I'm worried about this too, yeah. Are we doing anything to mediate this?
Well, I'm worried that you're going to create a friction here and that it's going to lead both parties to get sort of more antagonistic, which wouldn't be good for others. As for mediation, I think the United States can create a more conducive environment sometimes on some of these issues. For example, financial regulation. This is where with the FSB process and others, you can multilateralize these. and this goes to my concern about US policy. I think the greatest weakness for Biden now in the Pacific as well as with Europe is that I'm afraid that because of his domestic constituencies, his trade policy is put on the back burner. And he's got a very difficult Democratic Party coalition that he's got to sort of keep moving in the right direction. By and large, a lot of his supporters are protectionist. And yet I personally think it'll be hard to lead a multilateral policy in Asia or Europe if you don't have a trade policy that's looking not just to protect existing constituencies, but deal with some of the difficult rules, such as for data and digital services, which are at the heart of future business training. I think you'll see business pressures on this for Biden, but it's quite clear from early statements, this is where they're going to be cautious. You could see perhaps dealing with some disputes like Airbus and Boeing, but my own view of multilateral system is that I'm a person who negotiated a lot of free trade agreements. I believe that those are important to set the standards for the future.
There's a question here that I think I know the answer to. It's for you, but I think I can answer it. Is there a past or present diplomat and or world leader that has greatly earned your respect, and why? To the person who asked this question, I have such a good book recommendation for you.
Yes, well, that's probably, in a way, there are a number of people in different ways. So, I put Alexander Hamilton in as kind of the first chapter after Ben Franklin. And that wasn't accidental. I wanted to emphasize his role with economic diplomacy. Abraham Lincoln is always a genius, and there's a little told about how we avoided British and French intervention in the Civil War. Teddy Roosevelt, people tend to associate with the Great White Fleet and going up San Juan Hill, but in fact, he was an extremely skilled mediator. And I think Germans will find interesting kind of how he worked with the Kaiser on the Russo-Japanese War or the first Moroccan crisis, which again, most Germans will probably forget, but that was one of these potential explosions on the fringe of Europe, like the Balkans within a decade, that could have led to World War. I like some of the people in what's called the interwar period: Charles Evans Hughes, Elihu Root, Cordell Hull on trade, because they had to work with the politics of their time. And what sort of Charles Evans Hughes, who by the way was almost elected president in 1916, puts together this Washington Naval Conference that some people just associate with arms control. But what you can really see is he was trying to connect arms control with regional security. Now, that's relevant if you're thinking about North Korea nuclear program and how it fits in with Northeast Asia. It's relevant if you think about Iran. It's more the nuclear program, other issues. So, and then of course, obviously I have a great respect for Bush and Baker, and for Reagan. He's a person probably it's still a little hard for Europeans to understand his role. That chapter is one that kind of shows how he used speeches not only to think through issues, but articulate kind of a vision for the end of the Cold War, which was quite important, little understood at the time, but it also had to be complemented by negotiating partners, where George Shultz and Baker played that role. So this really goes back to the point that you and I talked about sort of pluralism and multiplicity. There are different models and experiences that people can draw from.
I'm very tempted to ask you, and what about diplomats from other countries? Who are your favorites? But I know we don't have forever, and we have to wrap this up. And this was a wonderful conversation. I look forward to continuing it for weeks and weeks and weeks.
Well, thank you for having me, Claire. I enjoyed being with all of you. And thanks for the Germans who gave us some time today.
Thank you very much to everyone who tuned in, and again to Bartley and to Amerikahaus. And thank you, Ambassador.
My pleasure.
Can we turn back to me now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I don't know if the camera is up. Dominique, are we good? Okay. Here we go. Am I back? Here we go. Yay, I'm back. So thank you. Two sentences that I wanted to take away from the book as a wonderful way to close tonight. I love that you said that the Americans are practical and good at finding practical solutions to problems, because that can give us all hope going forward now. And the other takeaway that you also mentioned quite often, but it's really true, the importance of the alliance system and coming out of what the last 4 years, both diplomatically and economically. I think that what you have to say about that should serve as a guide to our public servants on both sides of the Atlantic. From my side, I want to say, Claire, thank you so much for coming tonight. Can you tell us how to follow you and your deep dive journalism at the Cosmopolitan Globalist?
Absolutely. It's Berlinski, like the city Berlin, and the sport ski, S-K-I, not S-K-Y. First name Claire, with all 3 vowels. If you Google that, you'll find me. I'm the only one there is. And the Cosmopolitan Globalist, oddly, is also the only such named publication. No one else seems to want to call themselves the Cosmopolitan Globalist these days. So I'm not difficult to find.
Super, thank you. And I can highly recommend it's deep dive journalism that's doing a wonderful thing, providing a new viewpoint on what's going on right now.
Cosmopolitan and global, yeah.
So I'm going to go back to this again. I really had so much fun reading it. The book is America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom tonight, Bob. And you have an open invitation to come back and do this in person with a proper dinner and a reception when the health situation allows.
Well, I always love to visit Munich. I'll enjoy doing that. And if people read it, add an Amazon review. The favorite one I've received was by a woman that says, "My husband loved this book."
Actually, everyone should just buy it now. If everyone who hasn't read it should buy it now. It's really, it's the ambassador won't be offended if you take a few moments off to just go order it on Amazon. It's really worth it.
No, it really is
charming. It's absolutely charming. It's just such a good yarn. And there's so much I didn't know.
So, all right. Finally, because I know we have to go, you've been very generous with your time. My heartfelt thanks to our members and supporters who make this possible. All of you guys with your support of time, talent, and financial donations. Thank you to the team behind the scenes at Amerikahaus, Dominique Rabe and Joanna King, who keep it all together for us. And I recommend everyone follow amerikahaus.de for a fantastic program of transatlantic themed events. Democracy only survives if we all work at it. You can sign up on our website, dialoguesondemocracy.com, to hear what we have going on. And you can follow the Amerikahaus website as well. We post together for events we're working on in April, in September, and in October. So wherever you are, thank you very much for engaging. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe and healthy. And I look forward to seeing you all at our next event. Thank you very much for coming.
It is.